So today on Keen on Yoga, we have Gerald and Linda from Ashtanga Yoga Paris, the first Ashtanga Yoga Center that opened in Paris. I think, when was it? You'll be better than me to remember this, 2000 and early 2000s?
In 2004. I started teaching in Paris in 2002, but really opened a special space in 2004. Yeah.
Incredible.
I was doing Mysore classes at a friend of mine's studio from 2002.
Right. And Gerald's French, a French native, but Linda is originally from Canada. So if we just go, and they're a couple, husband and wife. So if we just go individually through your stories, then Linda, if you just want to say first how you got into the yoga, because you have a really interesting story about how you met it in, I think it was in New York, was it?
Actually in Toronto. I was living in Toronto and I was just walking down the street. I was working in the fashion business and I ran into a friend of mine and she just said, "Oh, I just came back from a yoga class." And I don't know why. It's just very strange because I was just like, okay, I've got to do that. And, she didn't explain anything about it, but somehow just that word yoga attracted me. So I went directly to the place and signed up. And that Sunday, I started taking yoga classes. It was a gentle class. It was with Ron Reed. It was a Hatha yoga class. And then after a while, I was just like, okay, I think I need a second class because once a week didn't, you feel good for a couple days. It was Sunday. And then a few days later, it's like, oh, I really need that yoga again. So then I decided I was going to go Wednesday evenings. And so I started Wednesday evenings. And the class right before my class was an Ashtanga class. And after the class, they would open the door and there was this big steam come out. And I was just like, wow, what the heck are they doing in there? And the teacher, her name was Diane Bruni. She told me I should try her class. And I don't know, I just really wasn't into it. It seemed too sporty. I was never a sporty person. People don't believe me when I say this, but yoga was different than sport. And so she convinced me and I went ahead and I tried it. And at the end of the class, she comes up to me, she was this, really cute, beautiful woman. And she's like, "So how did you like it?" And my answer was, "I hated it." and she was like, "Try again." And I'm like, okay, because it was full primary class. She put me, I was married. I had my legs behind my neck. She put me, in the tortoise pose. And then she walked away. And I remember just like, okay, now what am I supposed to do? I was like pinned to the ground with my own legs, basically. So I went back to that class and slowly, after you kind of get into the routine, then I really enjoyed it. And she was just fixed on getting me to be, an Ashtangi. And so she invited me to her house where Danny Paradise and Ron Reed were doing the advanced series. And she had me watch this. It was just me, Danny's girlfriend, and Diane and Ron. And I'd only been doing Ashtanga, I don't know, maybe like a month, 5 weeks, something like this. And after that, I was just like, yeah, okay, this is pretty cool. And so then I started doing some Mysore with Ron. He had another room, and very soon then I moved to New York, and Ron had suggested I practice with Eddie. So I was already, actually, before I moved to New York, I'd seen Eddie many times. Every time I went to New York, I went to practice with him. And, kind of just, it went really fast, like first 1 day a week, a few weeks later, 2 days a week, a few weeks later, 6 days a week, and when you practice like that, you just like, everything, your whole life changes, your body changes, your mind changes, really quickly. So, yeah.
But you had a profession, didn't you? You were in the fashion industry, so you didn't come to yoga that young, really. You must have been in your 30s, right?
I was 27 when I
Okay, right.
Yeah,
So still
and
fairly lucky to get in young.
Serious. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, but I was traveling a lot, and I had an important job, but it was still, it was important to me. It became really important to me. And then every evening I was reading the Yoga Sutras or Buddhist talks and doing meditation, and it was transformative. Yeah.
How did it shift from your regular job and not being off put by this crazy demonstration of the advanced series and continue, and excited by it and continuing practice to develop to becoming a yoga teacher? And how did that transition happen for you? Because it's always an interesting kind of juncture of people's lives when they decide, that they're on one trajectory and they kind of like completely jump ship, as it were, and go to doing something completely different with their lives.
Yeah, and I was pretty into the fashion business, My life was all around all my friends, everybody, everything I did. But, Diane, from the beginning, she told me that I'm going to teach yoga. And I think I already told you that, when she told me this, I thought, yeah, right, I'm going to be the president of Calvin Klein, I had no desire at all to teach yoga. It was, I don't know where she even saw that. I asked her years later, what was that? Why did you say this to me? And she said it was just obvious. So I don't know what she saw that I couldn't see. And then, because when you're practicing so intensely, and not only, I think it wasn't just the physical practice, because I was really investigating, I was doing self-inspection, reading and meditating on what I was reading. And so it was changing me, I think, from the inside. And when I was young, I always thought that if I got this kind of power position and I had, like a certain amount of money, prestige and all this, that this was going to make me somebody, right? And then I realized that wasn't really making me somebody. It was this shell, I had the right look and the right shell for it all. But inside, I was still this person that was suffering from, lots of things from childhood and all that. So whereas the yoga was what really helped, so getting the shell was interesting, it was exciting and all that, but it didn't change me on the inside, whereas yoga was doing this. And so at some point I was starting to feel kind of disappointed in my role in the fashion world. I was feeling like I wasn't really doing something of meaning. And I hate to say that because people out there in the fashion business, I think everybody has the right to do whatever gives them meaning. And, now as somebody who's been teaching for a long time, I can recognize that you can have a lot of meaning in any job you do. But that was just my path, that I really needed to change and do something that I felt gave me more meaning. And sharing this yoga philosophy and lifestyle and practice was something that was going to give me more meaning, to really help people instead of getting them to have nice clothes. But, nice clothes aren't bad either, At the time it was just like, okay, well, nice clothes, art, I was working in high fashion, so it was kind of artistic and all this. But a deeper meaning. And so this is really what made me change. And I was supposed to go back. I was living in Paris for my job, and I was supposed to go back to New York. My 2-year, stint was coming to an end. And I was just like, I think this is where I should stay and try to introduce this yoga, because there was so little yoga in Paris. And I was shocked, coming from New York where, there's still community, it's a very strong community. And so that's what I did. And I started to build a small community and and slowly this emerged. And
let's talk about the how you started Ashtanga Yoga Paris. But first, I'm going to ask Gerald for his start of yoga, because it's very different to yours. I know for a fact, having read some really interesting stuff, that Gerald met Pattabhi Jois very early on in the 80s, right? Was that right?
No, early 90s. The first time I went to Mysore was the end of 91. And I remember well because it was in November, because after I started, his granddaughter got married, and there was this big ceremony with the marriage, and for like 4 or 5 days, eating and blah blah blah, and there was no yoga class at the time, so I was a bit bummed out because I had just started this practice, and I was just like, wow. And then we stopped for like 4 or 5 days, just to eat, and like there was all the ceremonies, like the Indians do, and so that's why I remember very well when I started, because it was Shami's wedding. Sharat's sister who got wed, at the time. So yeah, it was end of 91. Yeah. So I started. I had started yoga by myself with a book while I was traveling. I was traveling in Southeast Asia with a backpack, like early 90s. And end of the 80s, early 90s. And then I got into yoga in Thailand, actually, in Koh Phangan. That's where I took my first yoga class. It was not Ashtanga, it was Shivananda yoga. And I was really impressed because the teacher, he was an American guy, and he was probably in his 50s. And what he was doing, he was doing the poses, demonstrating the poses, and then we had to do them, And I was amazed because I was like, early 30, maybe, 30. And he was like probably like 25 years older than me. And I couldn't do anything that he was doing, I was amazed, And it was soft yoga, but after like 2 hours, I felt really, really good, because at the time as well, I didn't have a very healthy lifestyle, I was smoking, I was drinking, partying, 25, 30, what people do usually. So anyway, I was not very healthy, and after the yoga class, I felt really good. So then this guy, his name was Troy, he recommended a book to me at the end of the class. I went there a couple of times, and I asked him a book about yoga, and he recommended this book from Swami Vishnu Devananda called The Complete Illustrated Book of Yoga. And during my travel in Kathmandu, I managed to find that book in a second-hand bookstore, And I was, wow, this is the book that this guy recommended. So I bought the book, I read it, and I was just like, wow, this is, it talked about yoga philosophy. And at the end of the book, there was some pictures, and he gave some like sequences of poses to do, So I was really happy. And I started to do yoga by myself, in my room every day, doing my little sequence. And then I did that for a couple of years. And in the end, I was just like, okay, now I started to be really into yoga, and I was looking for kind of a teacher. And I heard, while I was traveling, I met a few people who told me about this teacher in India. I had never been in India. And people told me about this teacher in South India that was really good, Pattabhi Jois. But you remember, it was in early 90s, so, there was nobody, very few people did Ashtanga. There was no internet, there was nothing, there was no information, there was no video, you couldn't go online and look what it was. So I decided to go to India, I said, okay, well, I've heard good things about that master. And so I just went there. I just had the name, no address, no phone, nothing, I just had the name and a city, Mysore, Pattahbi Jois. Okay. So I went there, and then I asked a rickshaw driver, do you know that man? He's teaching yoga, and oh yeah, come. And then he brought me in his rickshaw to Lakshmipuram, where Pattahbi Jois was living. And then I knocked on the door, and then this old woman opened the door, and I asked about, Pattahbi Jois, and she said, oh, I'm his wife, and he went to the market shopping. I didn't know he was married, in my head. He was a yogi, so I thought he was not married or anything. I didn't know anything about him. And then we sat, we had a tea or coffee, I think. And then we just talked a little bit. And then half an hour later, I see that old man coming on his moped, with his helmet on and, the vegetable in a bag. And I was just like, wow, this is the yoga teacher. I had all those thoughts in my head about what, kind of the yoga master should look like. And he was nothing like that, So anyway, he was smiling. He was very friendly. And so we talked a little bit and he asked me what I was doing. And I said, well, I've been learning yoga with a book, and he just laughed. He just went, ha, 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 you cannot learn yoga with a book, he said. So he said, okay, come tomorrow morning and watch a class, and then you can decide if you want to study. So 5 o'clock next morning, I went to the shala, to the school, and then there was few people at the time, maybe 6 or 7, Westerners, only Westerners. And he told me to sit and to watch. And I was just like, wow, I had never seen anything like that, because what I was doing was more Shivananda, so very soft yoga. You do a Shavasana in between pose. And there was this sound, breathing sound. Everybody was sweating like crazy. And doing like incredible things, and you had this old man going from this one to that one, pushing this one, pulling that one, I looked for like 2 hours, and I was just like, wow, this is crazy. So at the end of the show, he asked me, so are you interested? Do you want to try? I said, yeah, sure, I want to try. So he said, okay, come back tomorrow morning, 5 o'clock, and you start. So next morning, 5 o'clock, I went there, and then I did maybe like a couple of sun salutation A, sun salutation B, and maybe he taught me like 4 or 5 poses of the standing poses. And then he said, okay, it's enough, enough for today. And I was just like a bit frustrated, because I had paid that quite big amount of money for like, 25 minutes of yoga, and everybody else was doing 2 hours or more. So I was a bit frustrated, but then I understood that, Ashtanga was a different kind of practice, and you had to learn it, bit by bit. Because on top of that, I thought I was, after my couple of years of self-practice, I thought I was, getting better, but nothing compared to, to what the Ashtanga practice requires. So
wasn't it that first time, Gerald, that you had the story of Pattabhi Jois sitting down with you and putting you into lotus? Was that the first time you practiced with him, or did that come a little bit later, but fairly early on, right?
The first time. So I did, as I said, the sun salute and maybe like 5, 6 sunset standing poses. And at the end, he said, okay, sit down, enough for today. Sit down and do lotus. Take Padmasana. I'm just like, well, I cannot. I've never done Padmasana. And he screamed at me, said, take Padmasana. I was just like, okay. So I did a really bad lotus. And then he comes behind me and he put all his weight on me and he pushed me forward, And both my knees were pop, 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 pop. And I was like, oh my God, first class, he broke my knees, And then I stood up, I came back up, I removed my legs, and I was like, oh my God, my knees. And then miracle happened. Nothing was broken. It was just like an express opening of the knees, But it was really scary, because as I said, I was not a very flexible person, and I was a bit scared by the experience. But in the end,
after that, nothing happened. Just walked away, and you were fine. No problem with the knees.
I guess I limped a little bit. I probably limped a little bit for a few days, but nothing was broken, It was just amazing that actually nothing was broken. I was quite scared on the moment,
But you went back the next day.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. I went back the next day, and the next, and I never missed a practice actually. During the whole time I was in Mysore, not once I missed a practice. Sometimes I had the knees that was swollen, depending on what I was doing as a pose, or sometimes, you have back pain, sometimes you have this, that. But I always went because I thought the practice was kind of healing at the same time. It was hard, sometimes it was painful, but I could feel that inside there was some good coming out of all that. So, I never.
I think it's always really interesting for people to hear the earlier days of Mysore. Well, still in the Lakshmipuram Shala with Pattabhi Jois. And how did you? I mean, I know you spent kind of, we went back again and again and spent good chunks of time there. How long did you spend there, and how did things evolve? Like, was it you said an express opening of the knees? Was it ever after much easier for your hips? So can you say anything else about your time there and how long you were there? Flesh it out a little bit for people, because they love hearing that stuff.
I usually used to go, when I went there, I used to go for like long periods between 4 and 6 months. I always arrange, to go there, learn part of the series. Like the first time I went there, I stayed 4 months. I learned the primary series, that I was doing not very good, I guess. But then for one and a half year, I practiced by myself, so I improved. I practiced every day, almost every day. I improved. And then the second time I went there, I asked him if I could start the second series. So he said, "Oh, okay." So, he saw my practice. He saw that I had worked on it and I had improved. So I started second series, and I probably did like half of second series on my second trip, And then I would go away, practice what he had taught me, And then when I thought that, okay, that seems kind of okay, I would go back and learn some more, So I did that for like from 91 to 98, I probably did like 6 trips, like extended trips, I think 4 to 6 months.
And Linda mentions other teachers like Ron and Eddie, but you just had Pattabhi Jois as a teacher, or were you going back to Europe and having another Western teacher back in Europe, or just practicing on your own?
At the time, I was just studying with Pattabhi and Jois, I didn't have any other teacher, but in Mysore at the time, you practice in the morning, and then in the afternoon, we would meet, either at the pool, or what we used to do is to do kirtan. We had a little house, we used to do kirtan. People would come over, we would sing, we would eat together, and we would talk about yoga, So, sometimes you talk about, the philosophy or posture or whatever, So although I didn't study with other teachers, like Western teachers, I would still get some information, about different things. I met Chuck and Marty, I met, like very, famous teacher there. So, you would get some information, you would talk, about different things, right? But at
that
the time,
is really very interesting, actually. Yeah. Because maybe we did it a little bit latterly, when I was there more in the 2000s, but it's really interesting to hear that, you would kind of get all these teachers would get together, and obviously there were more advanced teachers, and they would kind of share information, right?
Yeah. Because as I said, as we had quite a bit of time, what we do at the time is I used to cook a lot, so I would cook and, do a meal, and then we would invite people over, so we would have like extended meal, for lunch, and then talk about different things, and share things. So that was nice.
I just like being back in France again. Were you cooking like a French cordon bleu with a little bit of wine and, no?
No. At the time, I was doing a lot of chapati, I had learned how to make chapati, and so we had like chapati plate, and basically, it was rice and dal and chapati and vegetables, I mean, we were vegetarians, and, basically the meal was pretty much always not the same, but, very, very often it was just the basic, And I remember Pattabhi, I had asked him how to get more strong, and he had told me you have to eat 10 chapatis a day or something like this, So I was into doing those chapatis, rolling the chapatis and to try to get stronger, so.
The rolling and the eating in both cases, the making and the eating of them. Yeah. Right. And what were you doing in that? I mean, I've never kind of asked you what you were doing in Europe. Were you working in Europe when you went back as well, or you just spent time practicing? Teaching?
I left like 87 with a friend of mine, I had been doing different jobs, like selling insurance or working in a laboratory photo, like developing film at night. I did quite a few jobs here and there, but there was nothing really pulling me, And then I had my good friend Manu, which is my childhood friend, from 5 years old. We grew up in the same street and hang out together. And then at the time too, he was working in a computer, but he was tired of his job. So we decided to take a backpack, and to travel to Asia, both of us. So that's what we did. And after a couple of months, we separated, and that's when I started to experiment with yoga. I discovered yoga, and then I was hooked with that. And then I would come back to Europe, and I would do some business. I had met a French guy who was selling like gemstones, in Thailand, in Bangkok. And what I would do is I would buy some gems and try to sell them back in France, to friends and family, and then get a little bit of money, and then go back to to Asia. And then after that, I discovered Pattahbi. When I went back to Asia, it was to go back to India and to learn yoga. And then after a couple of years of doing yoga, I started to do workshops, like in Australia, New Zealand, and stuff like that. So a little workshop here and there to finance the trips.
Okay, let's move back on to Linda again and Linda's journey, because Linda is a Canadian national, as I mentioned, I think, and ended up in Paris somehow, I think for the work originally, right? And then kind of like changed and became a yoga teacher and started off teaching very early on, actually, on the Paris Ashtanga scene, pretty much one of the only people I can think that was teaching Ashtanga at that time in Paris. So do you want to kind of tell us a little bit more about that period of your life in starting up Ashtanga in Paris and how you started?
Well, it was pretty crazy because basically the moment I stopped working in fashion, the next week, I was already teaching classes. There was one yoga school that was teaching Ashtanga, and I was teaching there. And I had met this American woman she was teaching integral yoga, and she had just opened her little place. So I was like, would you be interested in having Ashtanga here? And so I was teaching there. And then all the English speakers who were living in Paris, they wanted yoga classes, because I think that was 2002. And this is really when I think there was a big shift. Like you were saying before that, there was small groups of people doing, like when I was practicing at Eddie's, it was in an office building, it was just like some room. It was a terrible room. In fact, there was one window with a brick wall that was like this far from the window, a big pillar in the middle. The bathrooms were outside, everybody was using the bathrooms it was really not a very pretty room at all. There was no changing area. You just changed in the back of the room. But then around 2000, 2002, this is when things started to shift. And so a lot of people became interested. And so it was it sounds terrible to say that, but it was quite easy to get, like people were asking me for yoga classes. So I found myself, though, traveling all over Paris, from this place to that place. And I did this for 2 years. In between, I went to, India for 3 months. I would go to New York. I did a teacher training with David Swenson in Vancouver. I did a lot of different travels during that time. But then it was getting tiring because you spend so much time in the metro, or sitting in a cafe waiting for the next class and all that. So I was just like, okay, I think I need to just find a little room and have people come to me. So I was telling one of my yoga students that I was thinking of starting to look for a space so that people could come to me instead. And she was like, oh, I'm renovating the atelier in the garden. She had an artist atelier. And I'm like, seriously? She's, yeah, come. And she showed me it. And so that was, I think, in like December. And then it was finished, and I opened on February 14th. So I really didn't even have to look for a space. So I ended up looking at one space just out of curiosity, but as I had, and, I was a foreigner living in France. So, it's not, and kind of like an unemployed person, you know, and so buying or renting a space in Paris isn't really very easy. You have to have a lot of money to do this. And since she was somebody I knew, she just gave it to me. I didn't have to pay all this extra fees that you would normally have to pay. And so that was 2004, February 14th, Valentine's Day. And I remember I opened that first day and I had a full class. I was like so happy. And, but at the time I was only doing Mysore classes. And so I had 12 classes on the schedule. So evenings and weekends and mornings. And slowly people were like, oh, you know, like after work, I really just want to be told what to do. I don't want to have to think for myself. I'm like, okay, so then let's give some guided classes. And then after a while, you know, it's always the same things, always Ashtanga, same poses. Okay, well, let's do some vinyasa classes, you know. Slowly, things just kind of evolved like that to where, you know, and then that studio was filled and Gerald ended up moving to Paris. And then we, you know, moved to another one and then that got filled, you know. I remember in that Japanese.
Where was your first one? Where did you start off?
It
Where
was
that first studio?
Place Italy. Near
Right,
Place
kind of-
Italy in the 13th arrondissement.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So yeah, fairly central.
You know, there's a big Chinese community there.
Yeah.
Okay,
It's a nice
right.
area. And it was really, I loved it there. But then when we needed to leave there, you know, we couldn't find a place in the same area. So then we moved to the 11th. And, but this was nice too. And in the 11th, we found that place that was a little Japanese garden. You know, we've been very lucky, in fact. You know, we found always these, because as you're, you know, when you're a yoga teacher and you're from a creative background, you know, you're always willing to have something very unusual. And in France, you know, people like those very typical kind of buildings. And for us, you know, for me, I love something very different, not, you know, not typical. So we always found these very unusual places. We had this place that had a Japanese garden and all the old Japanese doors, those sliding doors. Yeah. People would come and they would like, oh, my grandmother in Japan, this is what her apartment used to look like. Yeah, so
wow.
This was really beautiful.
Right. Where are you now? So I guess
Then
you
it was
moved out
getting
there, right?
filled. Yeah, because they were getting frustrated because there was so many people coming, and in the garden there was always people coming back and forth. So, you know, at some point it was just like, okay, I think we can't teach here anymore. It's, you know, we had too many classes and too many people in the classes, and so yeah. So then we had to find like a real commercial space. And that's when we found where we are now, in fact, you know, because before that it was really more, you were allowed to work there, but they were more artistic places, photographers or designers, you know, things like this. But after we got to a certain, yoga was becoming so popular that we really needed a place where, you know, nobody's going to be upset that there's lots of people coming and going. So that's where we are now. We're still behind, like we've always been not on the street, you know, so kind of behind and more discreet. And so it's quite nice because you're in your little, you know, hideout and behind the big busy streets of Paris.
And whereabouts is that? I need to know because I'm actually coming to see you next year. So you're going to give me some directions.
Parmentier, between Parmentier and République, those two metros. Yeah, Avenue de la République. Sorry for my French.
It's a big avenue.
Yeah, it's a big avenue, but behind it, it was an old factory, in fact. So it's quite interesting too. You know,
and along those lines, Linda, with your correction there, the accent, which is very, very difficult. To learn French as a foreigner, you've always taught in English, or have you taught? Do you teach in French as well?
Yeah,
right.
I shouldn't say this. No, I really. When, because in fact, when I first started teaching, I was teaching to English people or people who were foreigners and they'd learned yoga elsewhere and, they were totally okay doing English speaking classes, lots of French people. There's all these, stereotypes of French people not speaking English. I find it totally unfounded. I find that French people speak really good English. I'm totally impressed.
I agree. Yeah.
Not like when I first came to Paris in the early 90s, it was different. But in the 2000s, and especially young people, they have a really good level of English. They might be shy, people are shy or whatever, but, so, and then when when Gerald came, well, he was teaching in French, I was teaching in English, and then we started hiring teachers, so they were teaching in French. So it kind of just became where, okay, I teach in English because, I teach better in English, of course. Everybody's going to teach better in their native language, unless you are really gifted at languages. And not me. I do not have that gift in languages. Gerald has this gift, but me, no, he's really good at languages. But for me, it's just like I get stumped, when I try to speak like Sanskrit. I've done so many Sanskrit studies and still, it's just like, I still like, what's the name of that pose? They all start with P. Why do they all start with the same letter? So it's just not my gift. And
I forgot to ask how you met in the first place. I think people would like to know that. Like, where did you meet, in France or abroad in India?
No, we did meet in France because, as I said, I was living in India at the time. After being in Mysore many times, I moved to this community next to Pondicherry called Auroville, which is like an international community. And I was teaching there for like a couple of years, actually, maybe 4 or 5 years. And then I was coming back to visit my family from time to time, because my mom was still alive, So every like year and a half, 2 years, I would go back to France to say hi and to spend some time with my mom and family. And I knew somebody in Paris who had an Ashtanga studio. So when I went back to France, I would contact that person and ask her if she would be interested for me to give classes in her studio. And she said yes. And Linda was a student there. She was studying with in that studio. So
I wasn't studying in the studio. They didn't have Mysore classes. So when he came, there was some Mysore classes. I was like, yes, there's a Mysore teacher.
Yeah. Okay, so I
just went to your class.
Yeah. Okay. So you were not to the studio regularly. Okay. I forgot. Yeah. Okay.
Gerald, you've got to remember the details here. Yeah. Be in trouble. Right. And do you teach? I mean, have you teach together or do you run separate classes? Gerald does the French part, the English part, or do you teach at the same time?
Teach workshops together and teach
right. You do.
Together.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But then what was really weird is that because I found out that we've been in New York at the same time. Even at some of the same events and probably practicing in the same room together.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, because I remember after, the people, after practice would whisper, so-and-so was there, so-and-so was there. And I remember after, him and his ex were there and we talked about some, events that we realized we were both there. And then after I met him when I was still working in fashion. And then when I decided to, start teaching, I remembered, oh yeah, that guy, where was that? He lived in India. So I went there before going to Mysore, in fact. So then I practiced with him there. And so that's kind of how we, Yeah, in Oroville. And,
Yeah, Oroville, yeah.
And then we started corresponding long distance, talking more and, because he was the teacher. You're not supposed to be with the teacher. And, and then we just, just started talking and then visiting. And before you know it, he's moving to Paris and we're getting married. We're having kids and yeah.
Yeah, it all went before you realize life is moving on, right? So
I think, Linda, you bring up an interesting point there that I didn't really consider this, but you're married and you're yoga teachers together. You both teach, and that's it's fairly unusual, really. I mean, I can't really imagine me and my wife both being teachers. That would be a catastrophe, I think. So, my next question is, how is your who's the teacher, or do you both teach each other, or what have you learnt from each other? Is there anything you could say about your path as you've met each other and how your ideas have rubbed off on each other or haven't?
Well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess at first, for me, he was a real Mysore style teacher, which I hadn't had in Paris. And so for a couple of years, I was practicing my own or going and traveling and practicing with other teachers elsewhere. And what was, I guess, kind of rubbed off was his experience of Mysore, like hearing all his experiences and and then I was taking his classes, I really like practicing with a group, I don't know, I traveled all around the United States with my old job and you're always practicing alone in a hotel room with a carpet or, going to the gym and people of they're doing weird things in the gym. And personally, I really love that environment of being with other people and having a teacher and the teacher giving adjustments. And so I was always practicing in his class so that I felt like I was always a student. I wouldn't say that I feel like, okay, he's my teacher, because once you are married and you've had enough fights and, all the normal relationship stuff, it's not like, you don't have him as my teacher, but for sure, I like to be in the presence of a teacher and he's always adjusting me and helping me. And this was important for me to have that.
Mm.
Yeah, and I practice too. Sometimes, I was practicing in her class, and we switched too. And she learned a lot about the philosophy and stuff like that. So I learned a lot from her because she's doing the presentation. In the teachers training, for example, about the Yoga Sutras and the philosophy and stuff like that. So it's good, it's, I always feel I'm learning something, like anatomy too. She's really good at anatomy. So, all the stuff that I'm not super duper, I learned from her, so it's interesting. It's nice.
And Gerald, how's your approach? Sorry, what did you say, Linda?
I'm a big thinker.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I can see that there's a good complementary kind of characteristics and approach between you two, actually. I want to ask you next, what has changed over the years for you, Gerald, in terms of your approach to teaching or approach to the yoga practice, even?
Well, the practice now, I'm in my early 60s, so obviously I don't practice the way I used to 30 years ago when I learned it. So it's more like I practice more slowly. It's more like Tai Chi, very slow. I'm a slow person to start with, like she always say, I'm the slow traffic, so I practice very slowly, and so I don't usually do the whole sequence, I don't do all all the vinyasa. But I try to keep a balance between like strength and endurance and flexibility, because I think it's important to have mobility in the joint as you grow old, because we all know that, the aging process is, can be a bit hard. So I try to keep, when I do a practice, I try to do a little bit, of course I do my sun salutation, my, standing poses. And then I try to balance, the other exercise, to have some twists, to have some like half loaders, to have, hip opening, back bending, inversion, but it depends, so I'm not, in my own practice, I'm not like traditional, what I mean, it's just like clack, 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 clack. It's, for me, I view the series more like, when you learn piano, you learn to do some exercise, and you work on the exercise until you can do them really well. So for me, the series, it's a little bit like that. You learn the series, you learn the practice, you learn the asanas. But then once, it's been like a long time, you've been doing it, then you can write your own music in some ways, So this is more the way I view it, I teach traditionally, I like to keep the format of the series. I think it's a very good format. But for myself, I explore a little more, I change a little bit, I do different variation of asanas and stuff like that, But, still keeping a dynamic practice and still, with the breath and the vinyasa and stuff like that, but less forceful than obviously when I was younger. I usually do like 1.5 hour practice, like probably like 5 times a week, 4 or 5 times a week, So it keeps me fit, and usually I'm in a pretty good health, and yeah. And in my teaching, as I said, I'm more like a traditional teacher, so I try not to change the format of the series. And I think it's important for people to learn, the series as they are. And then after that, if they want, when they do practice at home or whatever, they can do whatever they want. But I think it's important to keep
some structure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All sounds very, very reasonable, Gerald. And Linda, how has it changed for you over the years after kind of saying you hated it at the start? Have you grown to like it a little bit more over the years, the practice? It's true. Another point that Linda made early on is that the fact that you do a full primary, in the early days when you first learnt it, it really was like, here's your full primary class. Obviously, Gerald learnt it at Mysore, where it was introduced step by step as a Mysore practice. But we learnt it in the West, and Linda and I learnt in the West, first of all. You just learnt probably the whole primary in one go, and that was your introduction, really, we say a baptism of fire. But anyway, how has it changed, Linda?
And you're lost the whole time. You just feel like you're
totally.
Where am I?
Try to catch up. Yeah. What's next? Oh, just trying to get that one. That's one. Oh, you lost that one. Yeah.
And then you can't move the next day. I remember sitting in my desk, my office, like, better not bend forward because my abs would be so sore. I had to make sure. It certainly gave me good posture. I don't know how things changed because it changes very slowly. Again, as I got quite quickly into the self-practice, I thought everybody should do self-practice, but not recognizing that, maybe some people never want to do self-practice, or people like to have this, like, you're kind of holding them and keeping them secure by giving them some guided practice. I would say, and basically, our dog's trying to get out. Come on.
Right.
And because quite early I started studying the Yoga Sutras and Buddhism, so I feel like my teaching has always been influenced by the philosophy. It's never, I guess at some point I was getting maybe too much into achieving asanas. like all of us go through this period of time where it's just like, you're driven to be able to complete that series or, achieve that asana. And so for a short time, I was definitely like everybody else, going too much and trying too hard and, all this. But it was part of my growing up process. But I would say generally the yoga has always been more about a lifestyle, and really when I'm on my yoga mat, seeing where am I today? How am I feeling? Where, am I present? Is my mind going off? Is my breathing smooth? Am I comparing? Am I being mean to myself? All these kind of things that we often do to ourselves, but in the normal day-to-day life, we don't take the time to actually see how our inner dialogue is going about. Whereas on the yoga mat, you have that chance to really see, I'm disappointed in myself because yesterday I could do that and today I can't, or I'm getting obsessed by my big toe hurting, or, whatever it may be. That person over there is going too far, I must say that I didn't have a lot of that, because in Eddie's place, it was pretty concentrated, and most of the time I was completely unaware of the people around me, so much so that I have a very funny story, because I was in Prasaritas, the forward bends, those Prasaritas, and I would be right behind me. There was a woman doing Prasarita C, with the arms over the head like this. And so I just saw her arms and the back of her head. And, I was still a fashion person. This is like, I wasn't a muscly person. And I remember seeing her arms, and she had these big, strong arms. And what ran through my head was, oh God, I hope my arms never look like that. And then she looks up and she gets up, and it was Madonna.
Really? That's a brilliant story. Yeah.
This Madonna for, until then, and I hadn't even recognized like who I was beside. So I would say I wasn't really too much into the comparison, because I was already had so much of that in the fashion world, looking at models, and you never got the right body, you never have the right face, you never have the right hair. And, so when I was in yoga, this was really the time to just be in me. So I would say not like, so I don't know, I'd like to say how much has changed. It's more that I've gotten refined at it. Do you see what I mean? Like I was always because I started with Ron, who was an Iyengar, did Iyengar for years before doing Ashtanga. So I was quite already into having a certain amount of alignment. And as I said, I was already studying the philosophy and doing some meditation. So, and then I got more into anatomy, and it's just like it just grew and grew and grew, where I felt like I was getting more and more understanding of the subtleties of, the body, the mind, like on a cellular level, the breath, and this very subtle way of moving through the world, and on all different, the mind body, not just the body.
Absolutely.
So,
no, I do.
And so now I think
get that.
Reflects. Yeah. And so now I would say my teaching reflects this, but I have to also say that it also brings confusion. Like as a new teacher, I didn't know very much. So it was easy just to put everything in a box and try to put everybody in that box. But then when you get to have more information, I would be confused. Like, should I put them in the box? Should I let them, explore?
Get them out of the box.
And yeah. And
absolutely,
then all this came about, consent and all that. And so this has put me in a different place. And now I'm studying psychology, which is there's a lot of rules between a therapist and a client. And so this is what comes to mind now, is how to have that like that comfort of being a teacher, somebody's there for you, but also listening to that person and allowing them that freedom to explore. Right?
Yeah.
And so this, I feel like it makes a more, you're getting more involved with the student, that you need to have like this connection with the students so that they feel, I always want the students to be able to come to me and say, Linda, I don't want to do more. Or Linda, I want to try this. Or, today I'm just exhausted. I just need to go through the movements, even if it's really sloppy. Today I want to practice handstands, even though, I'm going to do 10 handstands, and I want to have this freedom for people to be able to come to me and feel like they can have that discussion with me without me just blocking them and saying, this is the practice, just do it as I say. This kind of thing. So I say that's where I am at now. Yeah.
I think that's a whole other interesting conversation that we've just kind of come to at the end of the podcast, unfortunately, because it is a really interesting conversation. You put your finger on another amazing point, actually, that yes, as well as yoga being kind of just more mainstream, so therefore you can have a kind of normal life and, a kind of daily practice, and that's kind of very normal now. As well as that, there's this factor of autonomy in the yoga class now. And, I think in the early days, when you first met Gerald and when I started, the teacher was the authority in the room and you just did what you were told and there was no discussion. And, it was either you do that or you don't go to the class, really, and now there's, as you say, the shift really was, it was happening before, but the shift, definitely with the Me Tooism and just recent times, really, in the last few years, we've seen a real shift and I think for the better in the paradigm of the yoga teacher relationship to student, and how that's kind of evolved to be much more, as you say, a discussion and less top down and pedagogical and more, a kind of just a more nuanced and reasonable relationship between the student and the teacher. So it's not just, you go to the class and get told what to do. It's rather the teacher's kind of facilitating, allowing space and kind of much more interesting in a way for the teacher as well as the student, in fact, because the relationship is so much more, kind of textured rather than just like, well, okay, I'm telling you to do this and you just do this, rather than like, how can we work together to draw the best out of not only my relationship with you, but, what the students doing on the mat, obviously themselves, so yeah, that's a wonderful reflection to end with, really. Yeah. Yeah, I always end, and just for fun with a silly question, really. As we're doing the podcast here today, give me just to end, Gerald, a guilty pleasure that you have. One guilty pleasure, being French, you've probably got a lot of guilty pleasures there. And same for you, Linda. After Gerald was disclosed his, you can join. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess being French, I would say food. Yeah, I have a sweet tooth. I like sweet things, and a good cake, pastry or stuff like that. For me, it's enjoyable, Like yesterday,
yes.
We have in France that Le Roi, it's
There's still the time of Le Roi, yeah.
Yeah, the galette des rois with the fève inside and the frangipane, like almond paste, and this I really enjoyed. So yesterday I bought a really good one and we shared that together, and this is one of my guilty pleasure, I guess. Yeah, food.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I share that with you perfectly. Having been in France, God, that galette des rois, I love that, and always the little figures you get in the cake as well. I've got loads of those little figures.
Yeah. You get the little...
Yeah. Yeah.
And Linda?
My guilty pleasure. I don't know. Should I really reveal it?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you have to now.
Mine, I would say that. Yeah, I would say that it's really terrible to say this, but it's all these true crime stories, the documentaries.
You're not the first.
Like me and my daughter, yeah, like, like these murderers. And sometimes I'm asking myself, why do I watch this stuff? Because it also freaks me out, it makes you nervous and everything. But there's something about the mind and the human mind, and why do these people do this kind of thing? And, so I really have this, like, when I just want to, it sounds strange, but just relax and do nothing, I'll watch like a Netflix special on some, like the Jeffrey Dahmer, like me and my daughter watch this, so it's like the girls like, sitting down and watching these killer movies. So yeah, that's my guilty pleasure.
Right. Well, you're not alone. As I say, many people actually, a number of people have come forward and confessed to that one. So I don't share it. I would probably go with Gerald and his Gâteau Droit, but nevertheless, you're not alone there, Linda. So very, very fascinating interview with you both. And I just want to say thanks again from Keenan Yoga for taking the time to come on. And I really, really enjoyed. On the third time we got this podcast in the bag. We tried 2 other times for everyone. And finally, we've managed to make it through.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's really nice to chat with you. And we can't wait to see you in AYP in the spring. This will be nice.
Absolutely. I'm really looking forward to coming. And you can find details about Gerald and Linda and what they're doing in the notes below. So look out for those. They run a bunch of different things, both in Paris and I think on the south coast of France, right? So you can find those in our notes. Yeah. All right. Thanks again, both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you.